Welcome to part 2, lesson 3. In the previous part, we talked about the social impact of industrialization here in the United States. In this part, we're going to talk about the environmental impact of industrialization in the United States. We'll briefly take a look at air pollution, water pollution, and in some sense, water conservation, concepts such as keystone species or engineer species. We'll talk a little bit about that. And also deforestation to include various forms of mining, whether they be hard rock or placer mining. Deforestation, of course, we could talk about here specifically in Williamsport. In the 1840s, you had the timber barons here that clear-cut many of the forests, but it also made people, what? Millionaires here in Williamsport. In reaction to the environmental impact being wrought by industrialization, for example, we mentioned Williamsport and the timber barons. Well, when you clear cut the forests here, it's great to go ahead and provide some jobs and means of living, but if it's not done in a sustainable way, what happens when that resource is gone? The timber barons can move on, but the scars that are left, the society has to deal with. In reaction to the changes being wrought by industrialization on the environment, individuals, social groups et al. Would begin to pressure governmental officials for change. And in the early 1900s, 1905 to be exact, February of, President Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, sanctioned the creation of a U.S. Forest Service. And the U.S. Forest Service then began to apply various principles and protocols as it relates to the forest, such as sustainable forestry, where they were going to actively manage forests in accordance with broad social, economic, and environmental goals. Alongside the governmental action as it related to the clear cutting of forests or mining practices such as hard rock or placer mining that left these huge scars in the ground and the environment more generally, individuals also pressured governmental officials to start to talk about the over-harvesting of fish, fowl, and game in the United States as well. Perhaps no better example exists as it relates to the over-harvesting of species than the American bison or buffalo. You can clearly see depicted here the range of bison dating all the way back to what would have been the presidency of John Adams, so the second president of the United States, to include buffalo being in parts of western Pennsylvania. Do we see them in the wild today here? No. That's a problem. And individuals during the age of Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s began to question the practices of over-harvesting these animals for various reasons. While cattle farmers today might be less interested in hearing that bison or buffalo herds are coming back today, largely because of sustainable practices, simply because the bison or buffalo meat is much more lean than beef per se. There are some success stories to be sure as it relates to the American bison. In Alaska, there is a breed of bison known as the woods bison. And through years of management, years of conservation, more recently, the state of Alaska has released back into the wild several bands or herds of these woods bison, and they've given local native peoples, the Aleuts and others, exclusive rights, at least for the time being, to harvest those they need to help sustain their communities. And the trajectory looks as such today that it will be open to actual American sportsmen again to be able to hunt these animals in the wild. In relation to air quality, while acid rain might be considered a more modern topic, something that's in the news in the present age, and how it actually occurs or what causes it is subject to much debate, to be sure. We'll leave that debate for a different discussion altogether. But we do know acid rain exists. Acid rain can create problems in both the man-made world and the naturally occurring world. Two examples. On the Gettysburg National Battlefield inside the park there is a monument to the 55th Ohio. It is made of sandstone. Sandstone not at all resistant to acid rain and the weathering that comes from it. And over the years, the monument has really deteriorated. Therefore, when we do design moving forward, we have to take into consideration environmental impacts like acid rain. And perhaps if we're going to do monuments, if we're going to do buildings, whatever it might be, this is a variable that needs to be put into the design practice so that it is sustainable for longer term. In the natural occurring world, an example is fish. Fish that enter waters that are more acidic, they build up a mucus in their gills, and the mucus in their gills is very irritating. And if they cannot get out of that acidic area, they basically suffocate and die. Therefore, higher levels of acid coming out of the rain, if they get into our streams and lakes, it could create a freshwater problem for fish and fisheries management. Clearly, as it relates to air quality, we'd have to at least bring up this idea of ozone depletion. Now, while we're not going to enter into the debate over what causes it here, because clearly you have some entrenched folks on various sides of the political aisle in the United States as it relates to what causes this. Most all can agree that at least ozone has depleted, especially over the South Pole, which presents perhaps a challenge and at the same time an opportunity. As a way to perhaps link clear cutting of forests and air quality, or in this case the ozone, one such variable that I think has received less attention that perhaps should receive more moving forward has to do with the clear cutting of forests. As depicted in the image on this slide, you'll notice the areas in green are areas where trees are gaining growing stock, so the number of trees that are being cut is less than those that are being planted. Whereas those in the red are areas that are losing growing stock, meaning that the number of trees that are being processed and cut down outpaces those that are being planted. Might there be a correlation here between the loss of growing stock and the fact that the ozone is being depleted in the South Pole? A variable that perhaps needs to be taken into consideration. While en route this detour away from American environmentalism per se into the more international arena, I think we'd have to also talk about the marine world or fisheries. And the question I would have for you is the same one that's posed here. Can an argument be made that conservation efforts in the marine world should perhaps take precedence over those on land? If, for example, the world is predominantly water, and it is, should more attention be paid to what's happening in the marine world, whether it be the amount of plastics that are being used or other issues, such as the overharvesting of animals? And an excellent example of an important species that was being overharvested were sea otters. Now, back during the first industrial revolution and the opening of America in the 1800s, early to mid 1800s, the Russian-American company, led by Alexander Baranov, had begun to develop a very big fur trade, largely around and due to the harvesting of these animals, these sea otters. The sea otters were almost hunted to extinction, largely because of the value of their pelts. Their hair count was so dense it provided great warmth, yet at the same time it was ridiculously soft. So unfortunately for the animal, it provided warmth and softness, two things that are prized by individuals that are looking for furs. The problem as it relates to sea otters, and maybe even more so than bison, is the fact that a sea otter is an example of a keystone or engineering species. And that simply means that if you take this species out of an ecological system, the entire system could perhaps collapse, and that's problematic. As an example of the impact of sea otters, I would ask that you take a look at this slide, specifically the bottom left part of the slide, where it shows a picture with sea otters, a healthy kelp forest, and one without, which shows a pretty barren area of the sea. So the kelp has been removed largely because kelp are eaten by sea urchins. What's interesting, however, is that one of the favorite foods of sea otters is, guess what? Sea urchins. So if you allow sea otters to continue to be the apex predator to the sea urchins, you can limit the amount of damage in the kelp forests. And you say, okay, big deal, what do kelp forests do? Well, the kelp forests are impactful in numerous ways. They can reduce the amount of wave action along coastal areas. They support all sorts of fish, lobster, rock shrimp, and there's even a medicinal value to kelp. All of your toothpastes that are out there are in some ways, they have alginic acids in them that come from kelp as well. So this is just one brief example of the impact of sea otters. And if you remove sea otters, what's the ultimate impact in the marine world? Technology can assist with bringing back and maintaining healthy populations of species, especially those like the sea otter, because there are globally recognized areas like these MPAs or marine protected areas where technological surveillance can help maintain healthy populations. We can keep folks out, limit the amount of fishing and overfishing in areas, and help to bring back these populations of sea otters in many ways the same way we did these woods bison. With conservation in mind and bringing us back to America more specifically, I want to go back to President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's day, and talk briefly about conservation efforts that started there and that we've built upon in the roughly little better than 100 years since these efforts started. Now, Roosevelt would work with what would eventually be pioneers in their own fields in their own rights. Individuals like Gifford Pinchot we associate with U.S. Forest Service, or friends of Teddy Roosevelt's like John Muir. John Muir would go on and found the Sierra Club. These were organizations then that would have an impact on subsequent and more modern organizations. We might know about Ducks Unlimited or Trout Unlimited or Bass Angler Sportsman Society. These are groups of sportsmen that want to maintain not just the environment, but their ability to go ahead and hunt or harvest in a responsible fashion those resources, not just for today, but so that their kids and grandkids can as well. Teddy Roosevelt was also responsible for setting aside millions of acres of land for conservation. He claimed this to be federal land, federally protected lands, and many states would follow suit and do the same sort of thing. So in most states today, you'll see both national forests, that's the federally regulated land, and state forests, state protected lands. Again, the idea to conserve so that what we have today can be experienced 100 years from now. Now, while clearly I'd like to be able to continue on and discuss at greater length how technology has impacted our ability to do resource management, to do sustainability practices, such as the use of agroforestry today, or hydroponics or aquaponics. And I would ask that if you're interested that you Google those and take a look at some of these modern practices and how technology is impacting what we can do. But I'm hoping here at least that what we've done is provided some sort of baseline on the impact of industry on the environment and how that caused individuals to think about the way we act and interact with nature about us. And I'll leave you with this thought before we move into lesson 4 and the ultramodern world. If technology and industry created environmental problems, might not technology and industry also correct them? Dr. JC out. Lesson 4 next.